Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's April 4th, 1977, and it's Dialogue Conspiracy number 263. I received several copies of books published by the U.S. Labor Party that I referred to several programs back on the Trilateral Commission. This book is called The Trilateral Commission's Coup d'etat. They're very important books. They're only $1. I have 3 of them if you write or telephone me and want copies of them. Otherwise, you can write to San Francisco Bay Area. The California box number is 4498 in San Francisco, and the zip code is 94101. And you can send for a breakdown of Jimmy Carter's Trilateral Commission. It's very, very important to understand our government, why our government is moving in Africa, why Jimmy Carter is worrying the Soviets about dissidents when we have so many military dictatorships. We have actually supported ourselves, the U.S. government, the smokescreen that he's using against Russia with Mr. Zabrinsky for the Trilateral Commission, who's now head of our National Security Council. And it's quite a detailed book. For $1, you'll get a lot of information. There are many people that do not have favorable comments, or they're critical of the Labor Party or some of their positions, and their criticism, I find, is very unfair in terms of research. They're the only people that are putting out this kind of information as thoroughly as it can get to the people out to the public, and I haven't seen any evidence that it's misinformation. And they have a diagram of the trilateral coup d'etat with the think tanks that were set up by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation, and it includes the media that's involved in this Trilateral Commission, and the political parties and lobbies, and the corporate private intelligence agencies such as Interpol, IBM, Coca-Cola, Field Enterprises, Exxon, Bechtel, Sears Roebuck, Hewlett-Packard, Transworld Airlines, Xerox, Standard Oil of California, Chase Manhattan Bank. It lists about 30 private corporate intelligence agencies, the 8 large law firms, the 7 largest, rather, law firms that are involved with the control of the White House and the monopoly of world power, oil and minerals and labor. It has a list of the trade unions that are involved, and it has a diagram with the names of the members of the Bilderberg Conference that are working with Jimmy Carter now. Many people want the names of the active members of the Bilderbergers that meet with Prince Bernhard over in Holland each year. And the New York Council of Foreign Relations, the people who are working with Jimmy Carter, are listed here, and the foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Endowment, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Rockefeller Family Fund. And there's a very good detail of the State Department people, the Department of Defense, the Treasury Department, the political parties that do work for Jimmy Carter now. And for $1, you also get a biography of many of these people, names that are not household words to you. It should be, and maybe we haven't done enough research into these people individually. A member like Mr. Blumenthal of Jimmy Carter's cabinet, it gives his biography and his work, in addition to working for Bendix Corporation and Harold Brown and Richard Gardner. It's got a list of the top people working for Jimmy Carter in government who worked with the Trilateral Commission and still do, and the Trilateral Commission was appointed by David Rockefeller 3 years ago, and they selected Jimmy Carter and his vice president to be in office in the White House. It's a very, very good book. It's only $1, and it was out of print for a while. It has a lot of information about the unison of the news media, the people that control our news, and our Labor Party, and our foreign relations. And I think that you should have this book. This isn't the book that the Labor Party put out about foundations and law firms. They are out of print on that now, and I'll let you know when they get that one in print. This is exclusively on the Trilateral Commission and the government and the cabinet and our president and vice president, with members of the European Trilateral named here, and it's very important. That's the U.S. Labor Party, San Francisco Bay Area. The P.O. Box is 4498, and the zip code is 94101, and that's $1. The book that I read from on the year before on Jimmy Carter and the Party of International Terrorism, which goes into terror on the right being funded by these various foundations for the purpose of having police state in the pattern identical to the pattern that Adolf Hitler used, is a book that is $5, and it also can be ordered from the Labor Party. There's a New York address on that. I understand they're out of print now, so I won't give it to you now, but as soon as they're in print, I'll let you know. The first edition of that party and the international terrorism is not available, but this is on the Trilateral Commission, a very important book. I have 3 extra copies. The first 3 people that call or write to me and send $1 plus postage, I'll send them to you, and then the others can use that address and get them. I want to talk this week about some more at length about the mysterious George DeMohrenschildt that I referred to. I referred to him last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, and a little bit the week before, because he is now allegedly missing, and I believe he and his wife have gone off to Europe. They're influential enough to get new IDs or passports to go to one of many, many countries, but he was the most important witness before the Warren Commission, and I do want to talk at length some more about his links to Nelson Rockefeller and to the OSS and to the Bay of Pigs operation and to Lee Harvey Oswald, the links of George DeMohrenschildt to the intelligence community in the United States. Now, I see that Frank Sturgis of Watergate fame is coming out with an article in New Times on the fact that Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald were behind the assassination of John Kennedy for Fidel Castro. Frank Sturgis says that he resigned from the intelligence community after Watergate, and we are supposed to believe that he's a freelance writer now. But he worked for E. Howard Hunt for years. He did at the time of Watergate. He did at the time of Bay of Pigs operation. And even if he had a letter from Jack Ruby to Lee Harvey Oswald or vice versa, it doesn't mean that it was necessarily a legitimate letter. It could be planted or forged, such as the 35 Howard Hughes wills that have been located that don't have the signature fingerprints of Howard Hughes on them. Frank Sturgis is still serving the CIA intelligence community by trying to push the assassination of John Kennedy onto Fidel Castro. It's amazing that the CIA keeps trying to do this with such great effort, because Castro is alive and could deny it, and Castro's security system, I'm sure, is strong enough to expose our entire assassination syndrome. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's why Fidel Castro is still alive today, because he could topple our government over many times if he told the truth. If many researchers like myself can sit down with various persons and figure out the details of these conspiracies, it isn't very difficult to believe that Fidel Castro's intelligence and budget for survival isn't as great as, say, my minimal budget sitting in Carmel Valley in California, where I can figure out who's doing these conspiracies. So the story of the oil people, the CIA, the links of the engineers, and the White Russian community, Lee Harvey Oswald, is the important level that the intelligence community refuses to let out of the bag that the CIA protected, the Warren Commission protected, and now they're parading Frank Sturgis around and trying to make a Castro plot on being responsible for the killing of John Kennedy. Just before I get to DeMohrenschildt, I do want to spend about 5 minutes talking about the Freedom of Information Act for several reasons. I don't know how many of you feel that you have been bugged or followed, but I did write to Washington, D.C., and I have forms, and if you don't have them, you can write to me or call me, and not this week, I'm very busy next week, and I will tell you how to send for this information if you don't have it already. I wrote to several offices in Washington, D.C. I have a list of 24 offices, and then some of those have sub-branches, but I sent out 14 letters several weeks ago to the FBI, the CIA, the Drug Enforcement, the Postmaster General, the IRS, the Secret Service, the U.S. Intelligence Agency, Army Intelligence, Navy Intelligence, the Secretary of Defense, the Air Force, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Army, and the Health, Education, and Welfare, to find out if they had any information about Mae Brussell or Dialogue Conspiracy or The Realist, because sometimes these Freedom of Information resumes are very deceitful, and they keep your information in some special little pocket. Well, I got letters from the FBI and the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency that they had nothing about me in their files. I got a telephone call yesterday from an agent who worked with the FBI and who was getting ready to expose his relationships to the FBI, just like Louis Tackwood did in Los Angeles with the police department. He exposed a few years ago, starting in '71, the links of the CIA and FBI to the Los Angeles Police Department. Well, this particular agent has left the agency and is doing research and helping various researchers, and he has told me that he has evidence that I'm very much under surveillance. In fact, he's coming to Carmel and doesn't want to meet at my home. We're meeting in another place because he says it's always under surveillance, and the reports are turned in, but they're not turned in to the FBI or CIA per se. They're a special department that isn't even listed here, and it's a top secret department. And he gave me enough information about myself and about various people that I visited in prison and things that I've done recently to know that he has indeed read my file. I got a letter from the Department of Treasury, the United States Secret Service, and they said that they had a file, and they sent me 53 pages of information from my file. And it goes on to say in the letter dated March 14th, 1977, that they exempted certain disclosures that would constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy to other persons mentioned in the requested file. In other words, they're protecting other people whose names are mentioned, and therefore I can't see my own file. It said that they are holding back some documents because they can't identify the confidential source, which means that I must have close friends or informers nearby that are turning in information, and they can't let me see these documents because then I would know who the source was, and they will not disclose the identity of the source or who furnished the information. And they said the techniques and procedures of getting the information, if it were known to me, would endanger the life or physical safety of law enforcement personnel, and therefore I can't have all of these documents that have my name. They did send a synopsis, and the synopsis gives the vision that Mae Brussell is a potential threat or a terrorist. They create a psychological profile. They had 3 different heights and weights, and I had to send a notarized letter with my driver's license on it, but the reports from these informers had me 5'6" and 5'4" and weighing 135, 145, 160, different hair lengths and different descriptions. But the subject matter goes on to say that they do have photographs of me. I got a marking here that they have a photo, and the date was taken in 1973. Now, I didn't get any information from them on why I was being followed in 1973. Of course, I know because I had a press conference in Los Angeles in '72 and tape recorded that entire press conference, and it had to do with the breaking of the Watergate story. But they had my photographs in the Secret Service intelligence file in 1973, but they haven't sent me the information on why they took the photograph. They also said that the criminal history was cleared. I had no prior criminal history, which was good. The report goes on, the subject refused to discuss her prior education or any previous training in weapons or explosives. That makes it sound like I'm hiding something when I've never owned a gun, and I believe in nonviolence, and I've never refused to discuss any education. I went to El Rodeo School from kindergarten up through 8th grade, and Beverly Hills High School from 9th grade through 12th grade, and then Stanford University for 4 years, and then went to University of California for a few courses, and at UCLA for a few courses. After I was married, I took other courses. I've never refused to discuss my education with anybody. It was 3 schools and then 2 extra colleges afterwards for some courses. And I never refused to discuss with any agent any previous training in weapons or explosives, because the only weapons that I have are when I traveled. Last time I traveled to Sacramento, I took my embroidery, because I do a lot of needlework, and used Airwest or United Airlines, took my embroidery scissors and put it in a box and scotch taped it till I got back from the trip, because a scissors is considered a weapon, and I was doing needlepoint at the time. They said I refused to discuss my education or my explosives, and they said the subject refused to discuss her marital status, which is a lie, because I discuss that with any person who asks or wants to know, and it's quite open, my marriages and my divorces. And then they have 2 lines marked out here, and the first letter is H, of the marital status. The 2 lines are marked out, and the end of the line, there's the word brown. And so I don't know what that means, but I have a pretty good idea, considering that I've had some very close friends who are black, and maybe the FBI referred to them as brown because they have that also written in there. They said no property was taken from the subject's home during the interview, and Brussell tape recorded the conversation and indicated she would provide a copy to the agency. The Secret Service came to my house November the 4th, 1976, the day after Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States. 2 agents came to my house, and I did tape record it. And I tape record it because I know that their reports distort evidence, and I wanted a record of what I said. And I'm glad I did, because their latest report, this is what they said. They came to the house, and they said she's concerned with President-elect Carter's leaving the country to vacation in the Virgin Islands. That's true. She felt that he, Carter, would be killed. That's true. There are no constitutional provisions, incidentally, for an election when a president is killed between the nomination and taking oath. Gerald Ford would still be president, and there are no provisions. She further stated she was aware of a conspiracy to kill Carter, and that the group involved in the conspiracy was meeting in Palm Springs, California. Now, I didn't say that they were meeting there to kill him. I said there was the potential of a high-level summit meeting down in Palm Springs when Gerald Ford was out there. Immediately after Jimmy Carter won the election, Gerald Ford went out there, and there are members of the assassination teams in that area. And she said that they were this is what he quotes, she stated that they're bringing Ambassador Richard Helms back to the U.S. for the sole purpose of attending the meeting. That is a lie that they put into my record. He wasn't home till long after that from Iran. She also stated that Frank Sinatra, John Connolly, Ethel Younger, Ed Davis, Police Chief of Los Angeles, and Paul Lazault, Ronald Reagan's representative, and members of the Summa Corporation were attending this meeting to discuss ways of killing President-elect Carter before he took oath of office in January. This is a total fabrication. They make me look secretive because I refuse to discuss my arms and terrorist activity. And this agent that I spoke to, this agent provocateur, had told me that they were trying to build a terrorist profile on me, that the agencies were trying to do that. But that would be really silly, because I've always said all along that the terrorists were funded by the CIA. They went on with a report that I was concerned that Rufus Youngblood was on Jimmy Carter's staff protecting them, because I felt that he had pre-knowledge or foreknowledge that John Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas, and that he had jumped on President Johnson's back before the shots had barely gone off. That was true. Then they included in my Secret Service intelligence file an interview for the Carmel Pinecone, January 18, 1976. They included 2 copies of realist articles I did, one on Martha Mitchell on the Watergate story, and one, this was why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped, and the other one, the Senate Select Committee's part of the cover-up. They sent me 2 copies of 2 of my articles and asked me for $10 for the Xeroxing of the 2 articles that I wrote, which I'm not sending them. But then they have another teletype message of a telephone conversation I made in Washington, D.C., which is interesting, because while I was in New York this last fall, in September, the Secret Service came to my house, 2 agents, and rang the doorbell, and my daughter answered, and she was really concerned. I didn't say anybody was coming. I didn't expect them, and I was upset that they appeared at the house while I was away, because when I take trips, I get that kind of harassment. So I happened to be changing planes in Washington, D.C., and I called Secretary Simon's office of the Treasury and asked why the agents were at my house, and that they should call San Francisco and find out, and then I'd call back. So in my message from the Secret Service intelligence, it says that the above called Secretary Simon's office and demanded to know why 2 Treasury agents were at her house yesterday. Well, what they sent to me was a copy of a teletype message that I wanted to know why they're at my house. But what isn't included in the file is why they came to the house. That's the interesting thing. The file tells me briefly that I've been under surveillance since 1973, that they've kept records of me, that they have a copy of my driver's license, but in their files they have 3 different descriptions. They said in 1973 that I wear glasses, and I didn't wear glasses in 1973. I had them. I had a prescription from a doctor but didn't use them. for about 2 more years. I just kept them. They were for long distance and driving, and I usually didn't drive at night, so I didn't have them. So the only way they could get that would be through some medical records that I had. And in 1974, they were sending information, the report says, to the Intelligence Division, including an interview at San Jose with a newspaper, San Jose College newspaper, the Spartan. They sent a copy of that in my report. They have information on what I've been doing since 1973, 74. They copied several of my articles, but they don't tell me why they came or what they were interested about. And the one interview I had with them, they came, I taped it, they fabricated the entire subject so that in case anything would happen to me, they could come out with all this information later and say, in our files, we find out that she was secretive about these weapons, and make a big profile. So that's my freedom of information from the Treasury Department. I don't know what I'll do with it yet. I'm thinking about it, and I'll write and ask what information they had in 73 that they were photographing me. But this is a very, I don't like the way it's written up. It makes me sound kind of mysterious, like I'm hiding my past, my marriages, my education, and they're keeping track of me anyway. It's an incomplete set of documents, and they padded it by sending copies of my own articles, which is 40 pages of the 53, which gives me very little information, and looks like they've turned over information. The other agencies I haven't heard from, and there are notes in these files of the Treasury Department that they sent to other intelligence agencies this information, and yet the other agencies wrote to me and said they didn't have anything. So there's a definite conflict there. And one of the government agencies did say in order to get my documents I'd have to sue, that they weren't going to turn them over unless I got a lawyer and had a lawsuit, which is time consuming and expensive. So I don't know whether I will or not. The only value of doing it is to correct the misinformation. I may have to go to the expense of asking for all the information in order to correct the misinformation so we keep the records straight. Well, now to George DeMohrenschildt. This is the friend of Lee Harvey Oswald, who's so terribly important to the story of John Kennedy. There's a description of him in a book, Coup d'etat in America, by A.J. Weberman, that describes George DeMohrenschildt's links to the oil industries and to the Rockefeller family. And I'll read you some of DeMohrenschildt's testimony from the Warren Commission, Volume 9, and part of the description of his links to the oil company from the book Coup d'etat. And also George DeMohrenschildt has written up in a new book that came out on the Kennedy assassination by Peter Dale Scott. DeMohrenschildt, as I said last week, was 53 years old at the time of the Kennedy assassination. That was 13 years ago. He was born in Tsarist Russia, and the background is important because the motive to keep the Cold War going is in the minds of all of Lee Harvey Oswald's white Russian friends in the Dallas-Fort Worth community. There was a purpose in having Marina Oswald of the white Russian family. These people felt that their land was taken from them. They hoped the American army would and will invade or take back so that they can be reinstated as the ruling class. DeMohrenschildt described his father as the director of the Nobel interests, the oil interests, the marshal of nobility of the Minsk province, and he took care of the landowners' property for the Tsar of Russia, and you know how popular he must have been. The Nobel oil fields are the large oil concerns in Russia that were confiscated when the Soviets took in. DeMohrenschildt lived in Minsk. His father was the governor there, and that's the city that Marina Oswald came from, and I have very strong reason to believe that she's a blood relative to the DeMohrenschildt family. George DeMohrenschildt and the family escaped from Minsk when the communists came, and they went to Poland and worked there, and his father had quite a bit of land. They made deals for land and money in Poland, and they weren't suffering at the time when they escaped from Russia. Many people got prominent positions because the Tsar's family, well, the Tsar wasn't very popular. Even around the world, he was a disgrace to a lot of the nobility in Europe. His wife, was a cousin of all the heads of states of Germany, Sweden, and the royal families related to Queen Victoria, and she was popular, and they were welcome in these countries, and also they could be used to help stop communism's spread. An uncle of George DeMohrenschildt, his name was Ferdinand DeMohrenschildt, was the first secretary in the Tsarist embassy, and he arrived in Washington. He married William McAdoo's daughter, and her name is now Mrs. Post. He died in 1924. And his brother Dmitri, his name is Dmitri von Mohrenschildt. The name was von Mohrenschildt, but DeMohrenschildt said that it sounded too German when it wasn't popular to be German in his country. And later he was to work for French intelligence during World War II, and he changed his name to DeMohrenschildt, and his brother is called von Mohrenschildt. They came from the family of Baron DeMohrenschildt, von Mohrenschildt rather, and they moved to Poland. They stayed there. DeMohrenschildt was graduated from high school in 1929, and they lived in Poland for quite a while, and they worked in the cavalry. He chose to work in the cavalry. He went to a famous military academy there in Poland, where all the Polish aristocracy were trained, and Germans had fancy estates in Poland. And this is where George DeMohrenschildt grew up and studied to be a professor. He started studying and later went into engineering and oil exploration. He described his brother Dmitri as a really ferocious anti-communist. His brother Dmitri now works at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. I believe he's still there, and they were violently and still are violently anti-communist. DeMohrenschildt, this is Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, got his master's degree, which is similar to a BA in Belgium, and he got a license in finance and maritime, and went to a business school similar to Harvard, an old business school. It was founded by Napoleon. It went into the Counselor Sciences. He was a very close friend when he arrived in New York City to Jackie Kennedy's family. His brother came to this country and married a woman named Betty Cartwright Hooker, and then he met the Bouviers. Mrs. Bouvier was Jacqueline Kennedy's mother. She was getting a divorce and marrying Hugh Auchincloss, who was in Navy intelligence and an operator in the Navy intelligence. He passed away just a few months ago. Mrs. Bouvier, whose name became Auchincloss, was a very close friend of George DeMohrenschildt when he came here, and he testified in Volume 9, page 178, that he used to go over to Jack Bouvier's sister's house. That's Jackie's mother, and he saw Jackie when she was a little girl. He remembered seeing Jackie Kennedy. At the time of the assassination, he was close with the Auchincloss family. Their sympathies were with the Germans, with the Nazis, and they hoped that the Nazis, he testified, would protect them and put back the people in Tsarist Russia. George DeMohrenschildt came to this country, and he was involved in intelligence work and oil exploration. He testified many times, and witnesses testified, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a drain. He could never hold a job. Lee Harvey Oswald was secured jobs by DeMohrenschildt, as I mentioned before, at a printing place, Jagger's Chili Stovall, which did government bonds and security. And DeMohrenschildt was a man who had many positions once he came to the United States, and I'll run them down for you to show you how stable he was and is. And he was criticizing Lee Harvey Oswald for having maybe 3 jobs at Leslie Welding, Jagger's Chili Stovall, and the Riley Coffee Company, and then the Texas School Book Depository. In every one of those jobs, Lee Harvey Oswald was with people from the intelligence community. But in this particular case, DeMohrenschildt's background was even more interesting. He first came to this country after going to this fine university in Belgium. He came over here with something like $10,000 in 1938 and started working at a women's sports shop with selling clothes back and forth to Europe. Then he went into perfume selling for a company called Chevalier Garde. Then he went in to become an insurance salesman. Up till 1941, he studied as an insurance broker. Then he went to work for Humble Oil in 1939 in Texas, and he worked with the oil companies in Houston and was very familiar with the people high up. He applied for a job with Mr. Suman, the vice president of Humble Oil Company, through mutual acquaintances. He was a polo instructor at a university in Arizona, at a school there. He made documentaries for a movie company. He had a cousin, Baron Maydell, who was a Nazi, and he worked with Maydell, and Maydell gave him some experience in a movie company. Maydell was important because this is a quotation from DeMohrenschildt, he was a white Russian. He lost everything through communism. He saw the future of his return through to get his estate through German intervention. He was accused of being a German spy, but he was more pro-Nazi. He was sympathetic to the Nazis, and he worked for this cousin Maydel, who was a Nazi, and DeMohrenschildt later was accused of helping the Nazis during World War II. There's a section of a book, Coup d'etat by A.J. Weberman, where he describes Mr. Maydel, the movie producer that DeMohrenschildt worked for. In 1941, when George DeMohrenschildt was in this country and suspected of being a Nazi spy like his cousin Maydel, he carried letters on him. One was dated April 5th, 1941, to Mr. von Mohrenschildt. This is George DeMohrenschildt. Von Mohrenschildt is address on 73rd Street in New York, from K. Maydel. This is the Nazi who had the movie company where George worked. And it said, here are letters mentioning this is the way it reads. Here's the letter mentioning getting your necessary letters from Nelson Rockefeller. You're to carry these letters from Rockefeller when you go down to Mexico. And it was down to Mexico that he was accused by the FBI of drawing installations at Corpus Christi and being a Nazi spy. Included among his papers when he went down to Mexico, DeMohrenschildt's papers were 8 $100 American Express company checks, letters of credit from the Chase Manhattan Bank, the Chase National Bank, New York City, for $1,250, letters of credit from Houston, Texas, from the First National Bank, and then money to be transferred in New Orleans to the Chase National Bank to be given to George DeMohrenschildt. And in case he got in trouble, there were letters from Nelson Rockefeller. Those were the links to DeMohrenschildt, not only the Bouvier family, Jackie's family, but to Nazis, and he was suspected of being a Nazi, but his references in case he got trouble were from Nelson Rockefeller, and he was getting money, $100 bills, typical CIA funding, from the intelligence community and a spy during this important period. George DeMohrenschildt sold vintage wine for a while, then he went to work for Schumacher Company. Pierre Francais, one of his best friends, the chief of export of Schumacher, had connections with French intelligence in the United States, and he became involved with him in 1941. They collected facts on people who were involved with pro-German activities. It was supposed to be an anti-German activity, but you remember that France fell in 24 hours to the Nazis, and George DeMohrenschildt was suspected of being a Nazi spy, and he worked with his cousin. So the French intelligence in this country could have been just as pro-Nazi and not sympathetic to the American position at all. As a matter of fact, the Rockefellers were mentioned in a book, I believe, Intrepid, as supplying German Nazi ships with oil down in Venezuela during the time of World War II. George DeMohrenschildt worked for Schumacher and French intelligence. He then went on to a sugar factory in Mexico and worked there for a while. He did paintings and exhibits of paintings. It was while he was doing these that he was suspected of drawing installations for the military. He was back in Texas in 1944, where he studied geology and petroleum engineering and taught French at the University of Texas. Then he went on to work for Panatec Oil Company as a field engineer. Panatec Oil Company, according to A.J. Weberman, was owned by the Buckley family, and Buckley's parents owned the Panatec Oil Company. Both E. Howard Hunt of Watergate fame and DeMohrenschildt worked with people closely connected to Panatec Oil. In 1945, DeMohrenschildt worked under Warren Smith, who was president of Panatec, and soon Smith and DeMohrenschildt quit and formed the Cuban Venezuela Oil Trust Company, an oil drilling company in Cuba, where they owned half of the whole country under oil lease. And when Castro took it over, they lost this oil to Fidel Castro. So you could see, in addition to wanting to invade Russia again, DeMohrenschildt had oil interests and was working for oil companies that had a reason to go back to make war against Fidel Castro. E. Howard Hunt worked closely with William Buckley in Mexico in the early 50s. Buckley's parents owned Panatec Oil Company. Both E. Howard Hunt and DeMohrenschildt worked for the Agency for International Development, which was owned by Brown and Root. They worked with the OSS, the CIA, and Panatec was important because not only the Buckley family, but Buckley formed the YAF. He was co-founder of that organization in the early 60s that brought men from Germany, Nazis that I mentioned, in time for the Kennedy assassination in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So DeMohrenschildt went on to the Venezuela Panatec Oil Company as working with the vice president as a field engineer. This is Lee Harvey Oswald's close friend again. Then he was assistant to the chairman of the Rangeley Field Engineering Committee in Colorado, and then he went to Houston working for the Rangeley, I believe it's pronounced, oil company, to promote drilling and producing oil fields, and worked there 3.5 years, and became an assistant president of the American Petroleum Institute. Also keep in mind that one of the things that John Kennedy was doing was to change the oil depletion allowance of the oil men, their oil rip-offs. Hardly any of them pay any U.S. taxes and get off with large benefits from our tax system. So that you see that the men involved with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Kennedy assassination had multi-motives: involvement in Cuba, Cold War against Russia, if they could pass the story that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist, and the oil depletion allowance was another factor. George DeMohrenschildt was very tied up with officials of the American Petroleum Institute. He was assistant president of the American Institute, and he worked with heads of these oil companies. He then went on as a consulting firm in 1950 in Denver, a firm of his own, an oil company that was important. He split partnership with a man named Eddie Hooker, a very wealthy person, multimillionaire. They were in the oil business, and they divided their properties and proceeds and moved out of the oil field. They went broke in their partnership, but DeMohrenschildt survived very nicely, went on for his 16th job at the Sinclair, from one oil field to the Walden Oil Company, and the next was the Sinclair Oil Company in Haiti. He married a woman named Dee Dee Sharples. He made new contacts, and he refers to a Colonel Edward Waltz, younger than his wife's mother, a friend of theirs of substance, who he developed a relationship with and developed a partnership at Walden Oil Company and involved in oil leases. He went then to work for Charmex, another company, and a Cuban Venezuelan trust company, and he worked with these various oil companies throughout Haiti. In 1957 he was working with an oil company, and then he went into Africa, and he worked with, as I said, the Panatec Oil Company in Venezuela and then in Cuba. He went for Charmex, was another job of George DeMohrenschildt. It was a Cuban Venezuela trust, and it had to do with oil and gas. And he visited then Cuba, Mexico, Ghana, Nigeria, Togoland, and France. And he worked for the Lehman Trading Company in New York. This is George DeMohrenschildt. He then went to Yugoslavia, where he was setting up a CIA operation so that the Soviet Union wouldn't get the oil in Yugoslavia, and he talked about his position over there working for Yugoslavia, helping them find some oil. He went to Ghana. He was supposed to be working as a philatelist, a collector of stamps, selling stamps for an oil company in Ghana in 1957. He says, I have clients in New York, Raguel Lehman, who owns the Lehman Trading Company and works for Sinclair Oil. And while there, he traveled around Africa and found out where the oil seeps were in the northern part of Ghana and the oil fields. And he said it was a trick. While I was there, I pretended I was representing the Philetic Society, but we didn't want to be known. It was also for the Shell Oil Company. And sometimes, he says, in the oil business, you have to use certain tricks. He testified in Volume 9. Page 211, you have to use certain tricks. It was an intentional part of Mr. Lehman, because Shell Company is supposed to go in there. The international part of Mr. Lehman is because Shell is supposed to have the real entry to all those countries as far as concessions go, and he was looking for seepage for the oil. And then he came back to Texas Power Plant Corporation in 1959 to 60, worked for that company, and then went to Mexico to see about contracts, and was in Haiti at the time of the assassination of John Kennedy. George DeMohrenschildt also had close friends in Haiti that were a white Russian community very high up in the Tsar's army, a very wealthy man by the name of Michael Breitman, who he knew, he described as deeply involved in the oil industry in Russia, Tsarist Russia, who he was to meet and make large contracts. He said he was invited to Haiti to review all the mining resources of Haiti. They don't have anybody to do that. That's quite a job when a gentleman like George DeMohrenschildt takes care of one entire country, all the mining resources, and of course using the oil companies and moving in to Haiti. George DeMohrenschildt was a very, very important person with important contacts. He had important marriages. One of them was Ween Dee Sharples, important woman. She's a doctor, graduated from medical school, Columbia Medical School, from the main line in Philadelphia. Well, socially prominent person with links to the military. And as I say, one of his last wife's daughter was married. Her husband's father is vice president of Lockheed, and George DeMohrenschildt's wife's brother. One brother worked for the CIA and another one for Howard Hughes, and the Hughes Corporation brought Jean DeMohrenschildt, his fourth wife, to the United States not too long before the Kennedy assassination. DeMohrenschildt described himself as voting Republican. He was very conservative. He was in Guatemala at the time of the Bay of Pigs operation. He used the U.S. Embassy as his mailing place. He describes himself very innocently as seeing men dressed up in these army uniforms and saying to his wife, "Hey, darling, don't those look like Americans?" When Howard Hunt was down there, DeMohrenschildt was there. He was down in Haiti at the time of the Bay of Pigs operation, and left Guatemala City not Haiti. He was in Guatemala City at the time of the Bay of Pigs operation when the troops were ready to land in Cuba, and then went on to Haiti in 1963 for a second stay there. Well, that's a little bit of biography, a little link. As I say, we could do many, many weeks on George DeMohrenschildt. That's a little more background for you than I did want to fill in. A man who carries letters from Nelson Rockefeller, who knows people very high up in Long Island social strata, Nazis, French intelligence, American intelligence. He got Lee Harvey Oswald the job in the photographic laboratory. He got him the job where he would meet Mrs. Ruth Paine, who placed Lee Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository. Well, our time is up this week on Dialogue Conspiracy. I'll see you next Monday, and maybe do some more on James Earl Ray for you. Continue on that. I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.
Those who think